My name is Nicholas Witkowski. I'm a professor of the history of religion here at NTU, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. I'll be the moderator for the talk today by Professor Tim Lubin. I'll be introducing Professor Lubin in just a moment. So a sort of good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody around the globe who is tuned in. Thank you so much for coming. I'll be the moderator for this talk. My name is Nicholas Witkowski, and as I said, I'm a professor of history here at NTU. As Florence mentioned, this is the first lecture in the NTU History Seminar series of the academic year, but it's actually the third in a series for our new NTU South Asia Research Initiative. For those of you who don't know, the scholars of South Asia at the School of Humanities at NTU have developed this South Asia Research Initiative in order to increase the exposure of South Asian studies, not only in Singapore, but throughout Southeast Asia. And for this reason, I'm delighted that Professor Timothy Lubin will be here speaking with us today about South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the close historical bonds between the two. I also wanted to mention a third sponsor for this lecture, which is the new initiative for the study of religion, trust, and society here at NTU. I'll be placing links for the information to these new initiatives, as well as NTU history into the chat box. Please feel free to follow us at those links. Professor Lubin is the Jesse Ball DuPont Professor of Religion and Adjunct Professor of Law at Washington and Lee University. Professor Lubin is an historian of religion and law in South and Southeast Asia, working with texts to study the formation, spread, and transformation of Brahmanical ideals and institutions in the ancient and medieval periods and their reception in modernity. This is from Professor Lubin's official bio. But although Professor Lubin has focused heavily on Brahmanical elements in South Asian societies throughout the course of his career, it must be said that his body of work is truly indispensable to the broader understanding of South Asian history across the board: political, economic, social, and as we'll say today, legal history as well. Professor Lubin has been the recipient of many fellowships, grants, awards, including most recently in 2021, fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Council for Learned Societies. And at the moment, Professor Lubin is a collaborator on an exciting and massive new research project comprising dozens of world-renowned scholars called The Domestication of Hindu Asceticism and the Religious Making of South and Southeast Asia. This is a really important project, and I urge everyone to check out this project, the progress of this project, which I believe will continue until 2025. Today, I'm very much looking forward to Professor Lubin's lecture on his most recent research into the ways in which religious professionals, that includes Buddhists, Jains, Brahmins, and presumably others, operated in spheres autonomous, whatever that means, we'll find out, from the power of the state both in South Asia and Southeast Asia. His lecture is entitled Religious Exemptions and Jural Autonomy in Foundation Grants of Early India and Java. The format for today is that of a lecture, which will be followed by question and answers. Professor Lubin will speak for about 40 minutes, is that correct? Thereabouts. About 40 minutes or so. And during the talk, please do enter your questions in the chat window. I'm gonna collate these questions during the lecture and try to get through as many as possible in the time we have afterwards. I'll also be putting the Twitter handles for NTU History, NTU South Asia, and the new Religion, Trust, and Society initiatives into the chat window. Please do follow us on these platforms, as there will be regular updates about fellowship information, new publications, and upcoming events. And with that, I hand over the platform to Professor Lubin. We're looking forward to the talk today. Thank you so much for being here at NTU.
Well, thank you for the invitation. So I'm just going to begin by sharing my screen. Is that visible now?
Yes.
Very good. Okay, so the question of whether ancient India or ancient Southeast Asia made a distinction between sacred or religious and worldly or secular matters has been a continual subject of debate. Some have argued that such distinctions are products of Western cultural history and too entangled in that history to be useful in speaking of other cultures. Many, especially cultural anthropologists, have emphasized how religiosity can permeate everyday life, even in Western settings, to an extent that no formal boundary between such spheres of concern can reliably be identified in practice. Of course, the whole debate is complicated by a lack of agreement about how to delimit the category of religion. In some camps, the scope of religion can hardly be distinguished from that of culture generally, since popular or informal modes of religiosity often seem to blur formal distinctions. The apparatus of state, and even phenomena that seem most distant from formal religious institutions, such as the apparatus of state, local administration, trade and business activities and the like, can involve appeals for divine blessings and sanctions or the involvement of unseen forces that one is likely to call sacred or supernatural. Today, I'm going to approach this issue by calling attention to a rather mundane looking matter: how kings and other social elites allotted their financial resources. For this, I'll draw examples mainly from inscriptions, looking to texts only where they seem to throw light on the epigraphical material. This may help us to hear more clearly voices besides those of Brahmins and members of monastic orders, such as the Buddhists and Jains. The vast majority of surviving modern Indian texts were composed by members of one of these groups, all of whom may have reason to emphasize the wide scope and pervasive applicability of ideals that we think of as sacred or religious. The people who commissioned and composed inscriptions also tended to skew toward the elite end of the social scale, but others beyond religious professionals are at least better represented, and the matters dealt with tend to involve more direct reference to mundane concerns. Endowment grants, beginning in the early centuries of the Common Era, conferred upon religious professionals, Buddhists and Jain ascetics, Brahmins in various capacities, exemption from tax payments and other obligations to the king, along with stipulated rights of internal legal self-governance. Not unlimited self-governance, not unlimited autonomy, I should say by way of parenthesis, but nevertheless, apparently substantial. Similar grants of foundation appeared more widely in South and Southeast Asia throughout the following millennium, embodying regional variations on a general principle that religious institutions have a justifiable claim to be insulated to some extent from the fiscal regime of a state, even if they participate in the economy in other ways, not least by contributing to the welfare of the polity that supports them financially. Such support is an intangible asset of the state, even one qualified, one that even quantified as proportionate to the tax revenue foregone. This status is also deemed to confer jural autonomy, autonomy over internal legal affairs within the territory covered by the grant. Now, which were the earliest examples we have of this? Around the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, King Nahapana Kshaharata, a Central Asian Scythian ruler of a small kingdom in Western India, captured some territory to the south belonging to the Satavahanas. Let me pull up my first slide here. Soon after, his son-in-law, Usavadatta, made religious benefactions at 2 sites where monastic residences were excavated into the living rock of cliffsides at Karle and Nasik in Maharashtra in Western India. He made a point of giving patronage not only to Buddhist monks in their caves, but also to communities of Brahmins, the priestly caste that was one of the Buddhists' rivals for royal patronage. In fact, the Nasik inscription was composed in the Brahmins' own liturgical language, Sanskrit, rather than in the Prakrit dialect normally used at that time for such inscriptions. His long inscription in Nasik Cave 10 records some complex financial arrangements. Having created a cave residence designed to accommodate 20 monks, Usavadatta additionally established a perpetual endowment with capital of 3,000 silver coins invested with 2 guilds of weavers at stipulated interest rates. The income sufficient to keep each of the monks supplied in robes and other necessities. An addendum notes, almost in passing, a much larger earlier gift of 70,000 silver coins, that is 2,000 in gold, to quote unquote, gods and Brahmins. A year or so later, the Satavahanas reclaimed their lost territory, reasserting their sovereignty through acts of benefaction. Around the year 78, Gautami Putra Sri Satakarni, who reigned between 60 and 84 CE, more or less, decreed his own grants of agricultural land dedicated to Buddhist monks at Karle and Nasik. Again, the immediate aim of these grants was to provide financial support for the monks. Revenue from the land that would otherwise have gone to the king was redirected for their support. In this case, as part of the arrangement, the fields were stipulated to be exempted from a list of otherwise normal obligations to the king. At Nasik, the king's order specified that these lands should be not entered by royal officers, not touched by them, not dug for salt, not interfered with by district officials, and that they should enjoy all kinds of immunities. He commands to invest it with these exemptions and take care to have this field and the exemptions registered here, ordered by the king's own words, written down by the officer Shivagupta, and referring in fact to the deed itself. The deed refers to itself by saying that this deed was delivered in the 18th year, etc. His Karle endowment had similar stipulations. These represent some of the earliest Indian examples of the practice of creating tax-exempt religious endowments that also confer other privileges on the beneficiary. In the following centuries, a list of exemptions and privileges, the list of exemptions and privileges continued to grow, first to a theoretical norm of 18, but ultimately to more besides in some grants. We find this practice recommended in contemporary normative texts as well. And while it's not explicitly theorized, the implications of such grants are clear enough. Persons recognized as being members of a holy order were considered both individually and collectively, for the grants were issued both ways, to deserve exemption from certain fiscal demands of the state. In later examples, moreover, it would become routine to give beneficiaries jurisdiction over legal matters within the bounds of the foundation, including the right to collect fines. 3 centuries before Usavadatta, India's first emperor, Ashoka Maurya, why am I getting a beep? There we go. Who praised the value of the dharmas taught by various religious groups and the merit earned by giving to Brahmins and ascetics, exempted the village where the Buddha had been born from making tribute payments. The word for tribute here is bali. The village is declared to be udbalika, unbullied, essentially, in recognition of its holiness. In forms of tax, especially, the difference between bali and bhaga is important. Got a slide here. Coming back to this inscription, the bali was removed, but also the share. There's a somewhat ambiguous statement that the village has made to have a 1/8 share, and there's been quite a lot of discussion over what exactly this refers to. I argue that that this is referring to the share of grain that the village would be expected to pay as tax. This is a separate kind of tax from the bali tribute tax. And the reason I think that is because if we look to some other early, not as early as Ashoka, but some of our earliest texts which talk about such topics, such as Kautilya's Arthashastra and Manu's Code of Law, the Manava Dharma Shastra, we see that bali and agricultural tax in the form of a certain percentage share are routine, were considered to be routine forms of revenue collection by kings. So Manu actually distinguishes between annual balim and, on the other hand, share of grain, either at a sixth or 1/8. So what I think was going on in Ashoka's case, since 1/6 is by far the more common figure to be used for grain tax, that what he's doing here is removing the Bali requirement altogether and reducing the tax in grain that the village had to pay from 1/6 to 1/8. But I mean, this can really never be confirmed, but that's my reading of it. Here, by the way, is the passage from Kautilya's Arthashastra, which talks about these forms of tax as well. I'm sorry that I don't know whether you can see the whole of that slide or not. But anyway, I think you can see enough of it. Using an expression quite similar to Ashoka's, Kautilya's Arthashastra, an ancient treatise in Sanskrit on statecraft, has some other interesting things to say about taxation. Kautilya exempts from customs levies, and this is shulka, the term that's being used, goods destined for Brahmanical ritual and sacramental uses. And notice now we've shifted from a Buddhist context to a Brahmanical context, but I think the principle is essentially comparable. In other words, Kautilya treated goods for use in religious ceremonies as duty-free. The examples mentioned here are rites of and sacraments of the Brahmanical religion. A few centuries later, the late Gupta era Narada Dharmashastra provides a list of exemptions due to Brahmins. And this lumps together a variety of different sorts of benefits, but it ends with exemption from tolls, vetana, and duties, shulka, nor ordinarily charged at river crossings. The religious justification here being made explicit by the stipulation that if the Brahmin is engaged in commercial activities, the exemption doesn't apply. So it's only when the Brahmin is doing something religious that he gets to benefit from this. In inscriptions of the Gupta Pallava era, these endowment practices were continued to develop and to take on distinctive regional features. Sometimes the immunities clause was condensed so that the property was simply said to be acharta bhata pravesya, not to be entered by chatas and bhattas, who seem to have been involved in collecting taxes, among other things. Here is a grant, just for an example, of one of the kings of Bagh or Valka. This is, we see the kings, there's a whole series of these grants, many of them offered to Pashupata clerics or ascetics, this being actually the period when the Pashupata tradition and also the region where the Pashupata tradition was really having its initial growth. The king says, be it known that we have granted as per the norm of devagraharas, say lands set aside for a deva, for the god, 2 villages, one of which is simply called Devagraharaka, situated in a certain area at the request of a certain person. And this is often how these things work, that someone, in this case, clearly a Brahmin, because he bears the Bhakta title, has requested that this agrahara be set up for the benefit of the god who is enshrined in the temple there. And they've now been given as Devagrahars for the performance of Bali, Charu, and Satra. Notice here that we've got the ritual application of the use of the word Bali as a type of offering, and for other religious services, basically. But that these donated lands are not to be trespassed upon by chatas and bhaktas. While these in the earliest examples, royalty normally figure in the role of donor, other types of donor typically increasingly appear in the role of patron. During the Gupta era and immediately following it, a distinctive new documentary format appeared in Bengal. more than 20 inscriptions that have survived, issued by local and regional councils between 432 and 543, and latterly in the name of local rulers assuming the mantle of King of Kings in the 100 years following that. Lands were purchased, quote unquote, according to the established practice, with a price listed, stipulating that they were executed according to the Nivi Dharma, the rule that capital value of the property should be preserved, a principle earlier invoked in the context of donations of capital for investment with the proceeds to support Buddhist monasteries generally. Gregory Chopin's work has taught us about this. Brahmins in almost all cases are the beneficiaries of the Bengal grants, and they are often said to have come from Madhya Desha, the Brahmanical heartland to the west of Bengal. But royal endowments continued to be common, and similar practices proliferate. Just before I move on, here are some of the stipulations in these Bengal grants. Here is a sample grant from the late 10th century from Chamba. Again, we can see that there's the stipulation that it's not the property is not to be entered by district officers or their servants. Translations are a little different depending on which translator we're working with, but this is the chatas and the bhattas again. That it will be free from tax, that it will be an agrahara for the grandson of the Brahmana Devanna, that the subjects resident in the land will have to deliver to him the regular share and use tax in kind and gold and every other kind of tribute, otherwise formerly due to the king. And that no government officers or their subordinates or any others will be allowed to enter the property to touch his crops, etc. And that the infringement of this order will be treated as a punishable crime. One other example that I can show you from the 12th century, the Rajibpur copperplate grant shows again that this village is exempted from all the burdens, cannot be entered by chatas and bhattas, will not be due to pay tax, but rather all these various sorts of income will be directed to support the Pandit Bhatta Putra Murari Putra Purata Sarma. In this case, as a reward for his ritual services to the king. All right. Before I run out of time, though, I do want to carry this story beyond India to Southeast Asia. The Indic land grant charter of the type that I've just been illustrating was imported into several parts of Southeast Asia, both the mainland and the islands, as part of a larger cluster of cultural knowledge and practices, as witnessed in the Indonesian sphere in Sanskrit inscriptions beginning around the 6th or 7th century, and in Old Javanese from the 8th century. Ambitious regional elites exposed to Indian culture through their trade contacts sought to emulate the Indian model of kingship and patronage. The primary beneficiaries of this patronage were religious institutions of the Indian variety, that's to say, of Brahmins in a couple of different religious guises, let's say, as what are known in Indonesia as rishis or ascetics, and also as Shaivas, and also Buddhists to a somewhat lesser degree. The majority of the inscriptions from Java record the creation of a sima, or freehold, and again, this is a Sanskrit loanword, a clearly demarcated tract of land comprising one or more villages and or agricultural land. Such property was often said to be severed from the watak, a local administrative unit. Their tax revenue on produce called dravya haji, or royal property, is renounced by the king and redirected to the support of some beneficiary institution, a monastery, a hermitage, a temple, something like that. The king could create a sima in his own name, or another individual might do so, in which case the consent of the king was requested, since revenue formerly paid as tax could now support the beneficiary institution. This arrangement is quite similar to what we've seen in the Indian deeds. So the example that I've got on the screen for you right now is the Kanchana copperplate charter, originally issued in the 10th century, but the form in which we have it is a reissue from around 1373 during the Majapahit period. Again, we can see very similar stipulations, though. The freehold is a bit more emphasis here on the independence of the grantee, but is not to be entered by those under the command of the 3 high dignitaries, and then a number of high government offices are mentioned, and also by a group of people called the Mangilala Dravihaji, translated here as the collectors of royal property. And this is the sort of ubiquitous group, often enumerated in very lengthy lists of exactly who these people are, although many of the terms are somewhat opaque to us now. But these are basically coming at the point in the document where in the Indian records you might have had chatas and bhattas. Those persons listed shall in no case intrude upon the freehold. The freehold alone enjoys authority over its royal property. Likewise, and by royal property here again, we mean potential tax revenue. And likewise, it is subject to this fascinating set of criteria called sukha dukkha, literally, of course, joys and sorrows, but it actually is then always followed by a list of misdeeds, crimes, and misfortunes that would have required some sort of adjudication or some sort of investigation, maybe punishments and fines. All of that would now be handled by the authorities who are the beneficiaries of the grant. So this is what the sort of thing that I mean by jural autonomy. Tabulations made by Antoinette Barrett Jones, who compiled data from early SEMA Foundation charters, show that between the years 804 and 939, out of 64 charters in which the purpose of the charter of the grant is clearly stated, 48 of them supported a religious institution. The same sort of charter could also be used to reward dignitaries for services to the king. As well, but the vast majority of them are for the support of religious institutions, most often designated with a generic label such as Dharma or Dharma Kshetra or Prasada. In Java, especially by the Majapahit period, as say the later 13th and 14th centuries, a distinction was made between royal religious foundations and free religious foundations. This is, again, a late 14th century text, the Arjuna Vijaya, which has a couple of verses which distinguish between them. As for the Dharma Lipas, the free foundation, those can be described as follows. They're built on lands bestowed by the king and placed at the disposal of the rishis, the Shaivites, and the Buddhists, for the sake of their offerings to the deities, as well as for their means of subsistence. So we have actually a definition of the Dharma Lipas there. And then it's distinguished from the Dharma Haji, which are built for the use of the noble families, descendants of the king. Both sorts of foundation are presented as meritorious and worthwhile undertakings. But the Dharma Lipas is being presented as meritorious, even though it doesn't directly benefit the royal family or the king in the same way. A particularly fascinating development that we find in Java, dating perhaps to as early as the 10th century, although the dating of the text is extremely problematic and has to be deduced through various forms of triangulation on details in the content that can be connected with epigraphical evidence, which is more securely datable. In any case, the fascinating thing that's going on in this is that in this new set of texts is that the question of the relationship of the proper relationship between royal authority and the authority of religious groups gets examined and spelled out in a new genre of text, which borrows its name, in fact, from the term used in Java quite often to denote a royal charter, namely a Shaasana. It means they're called prashastis and they're called Shaasanas. Marin Shtel, a doctoral student and a member of the ERC Dharma project, is working on some of these long overlooked texts for her dissertation. And her findings, though still preliminary, are fascinating and important. The Rishi Shaasana distinguishes, which is one of these Shaasana texts, distinguishes 4 sets of precepts. Corresponding, I would argue, to 4 overlapping or 4, in a plural legal environment, there are 4 coexisting jurisdictions. You've got Dharma Shaasana, which is that of various civic officials, along with the merchant guilds and their officers. You've got what's called Raja Shaasana, the Shaasana of the kings, past, present, and future, who strive in battle. But they also mention texts of sort of niti shastra type texts, that say advice on good policy aimed at kings and princes, such as the Sarasamuchaya. And of course, the Agama Manava, which is a reference directly to the Manava Dharma Shastra. Deva Shasana are the Shasanas, that is, say, the precepts of the orders of Buddhists, Shaivas, and Brahmins, and temple institutions. And finally, the Rishi Shaasana, which of course, actually the name of the text in which this is contained, are the Shasanas of Brahmin Pandits residing in ashramas. In Old Javanese, these are called patapan, and in free foundations, they say Dravya Lapas, as opposed to the Dharma Haji. This text also lays out the differences between the precepts of the sages and the precepts of the kings. Let's say between Rishi Shaasana and Raja Shaasana, saying that Rishi Shaasana refers to the precepts for the learned masters, the Pandits, the lords of yogins who are independent, swatantra, whose property is exempt, not subject to royal tax, by force of this collection of royal orders and precepts. For the scholars have jurisdiction over the hermitages. They are autonomous in the forests and in the mountain ranges. That is the territory of the scholars. They may not be disturbed by anyone, and not by the king in particular. They are absolutely not subject to Raja Shaasana. That's very emphatic with Tatan, absolutely not Kning Raja Shaasana. Another one of these Shasana texts, the Purvadigama Shasana, has something to say about royal policy and the independence of consecrated Shaivas from it. So this is a text that's oriented not to the rishis, like the Rishi Shaasana is, but to the Kashaivan, to the Shaiva, consecrated Shaiva clergy. Again, here, it's just making distinctions between these various spheres. Niti Swara, that is policy which is decided and transmitted in an assembly for everyday business. Adhigama, which is policy from inscriptions, from the prashastis. It refers to Purva Drishta, local juridical decisions that are the outcome of cases past and present, taking place in the places where cases are decided. Then they distinguish desha drishta, local juridical policy that has been put into practice. Whoops. Lost my screen here. Local juridical policy of those who have gone before in the past, and shastra drishta, local juridical policy adhering to the royal policy, Raja Niti, and the Raja Shaasana. All these forms of what is called royal policy do not apply to the group of the consecrated. So this is you can see at this point, Javanese authors deliberately theorizing and reflecting on the relationship between these spheres and the question of what the rights and degree of autonomy of religious actors ought to be vis-a-vis the king. So, although rulers, since, following in the wake of Ashoka in the 3rd century BC, really never articulated an explicit ecumenism, as say a conception of religion, of a category of religion that transcends individual religions, the way Ashoka did with his concept of dharma. Many did follow a policy of offering patronage to more than their own favored religious group. So my examples didn't show this. Actually, one of them did. I'm afraid I flicked over it. There was a good example of this, if I can make the thing go back, is one of these. Unfortunately, my screen makes it difficult for me to actually see the part at the top of the screen. Maybe I took the slide out, but there you frequently have cases of a king, for instance, who for the sake of the glory of the Buddha, will then proceed to make a grant to Brahmins, or vice versa. So you do find that sort of thing going on. Such grants, in any case, embody the principle that the religious aims and institutions have a justifiable claim to stand outside, at least to some extent, or to be insulated from the fiscal demands of the state and certain other perquisites of sovereignty, such as right of access for officers of the state, a claim to treasure above and below ground, various kinds of levies. The claim to compulsory labor is often singled out as something which is forbidden within these contexts, and the authority to punish offenders and collect fines. This is furthermore justified by the principle, sometimes tacit and sometimes express, that religious undertakings contribute to the welfare of the polity that supports them financially, and that this support is an intangible asset of the state or of the donor, of the non-royal donor. Royal donations were intended to confer merit and benefit and spiritual benefits on donors, their parents, or on their ascendants and descendants. But as for Ashoka, the stated aims could sometimes include the maintenance of public virtue or the continued security of the realm. Sometimes this value was quantified, as when the king is said to derive 1/6 of the merit of approving a religious endowment made by another individual, because he thereby will forego receipt of the normal 1/6 share of the agricultural produce of the land. And this is very frequently stated, for instance, in those Bengal grants. The dissemination across South and Southeast Asia, reaching Java by the 6th century, of a distinctly Indian model of patronage in the form of legal mechanisms expressed in standardized diplomatic, say, documentary formats supported by scholastic and textual models, provided an enduring basis for acknowledging this implicit relationship between the state and religious institutions. Patronage in this vein implies that there's a sacred sphere conceptually distinguishable from worldly affairs, even if it could be implicated in those affairs. Individuals and institutions inhabiting this protected sphere could and did participate in worldly financial or commercial transactions, and the inscriptions certainly show that there was no separation of church and state in the sense of a mutual neutrality. But ancient and medieval documents do show that religious individuals, groups, and institutions could claim and were often accorded a large measure of autonomy and financial independence from secular authorities, autonomy that was legally defined and protected. This autonomy was granted in recognition of scriptural learning, to support ritual practice, to sometimes specifically require the recipients to bless the donor and his family. Civil religion in ancient India and in ancient Java, as in the modern world, was a balancing act of granting the special separateness of religion, its transcendence, while acknowledging its role in securing the public welfare or the public welfare of the donor, the private welfare of the donor, that's forms of its immanence. Speaking of comparable monastic exemptions in early medieval Europe, which protected the properties, privileges, and internal autonomy of monasteries, Wickham and Reuter in 1995 observed that religious exemptions of this sort should not be seen as an infringement of royal or lay authority. Rather, they are the exception that proves the rule of sovereign power. The grants and texts we have examined here imply that there was a sacred sphere of authority that is distinguishable, but nevertheless inevitably intertwined with the power of the state and of the economic power of elites.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
I can. I'm sharing.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you so much for the talk. I do feel like it was sort of short, and I feel like there was actually a lot more to say. But I really appreciate this discussion. I really appreciate you coming to speak with those of us here in Southeast Asia, and particularly to talk to our students at NTU, because your work is so important in our classroom.
Well, thanks.
So we really appreciate it. And thank you for staying up late to talk with us.
Yes, my pleasure, my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, so with that, we're going to close the session. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending. And we do hope to see you for future history seminars and for our upcoming NTU South Asia events. We will be publicizing these on our Twitter accounts especially, but also on Facebook as well. So please stay tuned for that information by following us there. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you again at the next talk.